On May 22, 2020, an Airbus A320 of Pakistan International Airlines crashed into a residential area near the approach to land in Karachi. Of the 99 passengers, 97 died, only 2 survived. This accident cannot be justified in any way. 2 pilots attempted to land without extending the landing gear, neglecting one of the most basic and essential procedures in aviation. Investigators uncovered numerous mistakes, highlighting the egregious carelessness that led to this tragic outcome. What happened in the cockpit of this aircraft? Who is responsible for this tragedy? Let's watch the video. On May 22nd, Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 was preparing for a domestic service. The Airbus A320 was operating a flight from Lahore to Karachi, a very busy route. On board were 91 passengers and 8 crew members. The weather was favourable and no technical problems were reported with the aircraft. The captain, 58-year-old Sajjad, had 17,000 hours of flying experience, including 4,000 hours on the Airbus A320. He was accompanied by 33-year-old First Officer Usman Azam, who had been flying with Pakistan International Airlines for 10 years and had approximately 2,200 hours of experience on the Airbus A320. For this flight, the first officer was the pilot flying, while the captain was the pilot monitoring. Both pilots were fasting that day and had not eaten for hours. They completed all the pre-departure checks in the cockpit. The aircraft was scheduled to depart at 1 p.m. It pushed back from the gate as soon as clearance was received. The aircraft taxied to the runway and awaited clearance from air traffic control. Once takeoff clearance was granted, the aircraft lifted off. ATC instructed them to climb to 34,000 feet. The aircraft ascended and maintained this altitude. In the cockpit, the 2 pilots were having a casual conversation, primarily about the COVID-19 pandemic. They maintained contact with ATC and monitored the instruments. The aircraft started its descent towards Karachi. The pilots contacted ATC in Karachi, who assigned them runway 25L for landing using the Instrument Landing System, ILS. The pilots entered the approach path into the Flight Management System, FMS. Once this data was input, the FMS calculated the descent profile. The Airbus A320 is a highly advanced aircraft. In the A320, pilots use the flight control unit to instruct the autopilot. Typically, 3 modes are engaged. 1. Control of the aircraft's lateral position. 2. Control of the vertical position. 3. Control of the airspeed. These modes can either be selected or managed. In the selected mode, the aircraft flies according to the pilot's instructions. In the managed mode, the autopilot system determines the optimal flight path. On Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303, the pilot selected the managed descent mode and set the altitude to 10,000 feet. The autopilot system began to control the aircraft smoothly. ATC instructed them to enter a holding pattern to gradually descend and reach 3,000 feet. The flight management system then calculated a new descent profile to accommodate this instruction. However, the captain decided not to follow the holding pattern. As a result, the pilots should have removed the holding pattern from the flight plan. Unfortunately, neither pilot did so. They forgot to remove it, likely due to their casual conversation. They were deeply engaged in their discussion, which distracted them from making the necessary adjustments. The holding pattern allows the aircraft to descend gradually to 3,000 feet at the waypoint Sabin. If the pilots choose not to enter the holding pattern, they must use a steeper descent rate to reach Sabin directly at 3,000 feet. However, if the pilots descend as though they are going to enter the holding pattern without actually following it, they will be forced to execute a much steeper descent very close to the runway. This steep descent near the runway is dangerous and should be avoided. If they had deleted the holding pattern, the Flight Management System, FMS, would have recalculated the descent rate and updated it. Unfortunately, this adjustment was never made. Additionally, the pilots failed to review the approach checklist or brief each other on the plan. As a result, since they ignored the holding pattern, the aircraft was too high for a proper approach. The captain quickly checked his flight management system and realized his mistake. He instructed the first officer to delete the holding pattern, and the first officer complied. When the first officer asked if they should report this to ATC, the captain responded that it wasn't necessary and they could proceed. The captain then selected the open descent mode on the flight control unit. In this mode, the aircraft descends very steeply, which is unsafe for the final approach. Despite this, the aircraft began to descend rapidly as the captain activated this mode. Noticing the steep descent, the ATC controller warned the pilots, stating, "Your aircraft is still at a very high altitude. We can give you a holding pattern if needed." However, the captain replied, "We do not need it." ATC knew that attempting to land from such a high altitude could be dangerous. As the aircraft descended to 7,400 feet, the pilots extended the landing gear, likely to increase drag. Within a minute, the aircraft had descended to about 2,900 feet. Again, ATC offered a holding pattern, but the captain declined. At 3,900 feet, ATC reiterated the suggestion for a holding pattern, but the crew ignored it again. At this point, an overspeed warning started sounding in the cockpit, and a red warning light appeared on the cockpit display. Both pilots ignored the warnings. Due to the overspeed, the autopilot disconnected. Warnings continued to come from ATC and various systems in the cockpit. During this time, one of the pilots retracted the landing gear without any call-out or discussion. Despite the precarious situation, ATC granted landing clearance, likely assuming that the aircraft needed to land given the circumstances. At 1,000 feet, the first officer asked the captain if they should request a holding pattern. However, the captain replied that it was not necessary and took control, saying he could handle it. The captain attempted to land the aircraft quickly. Unfortunately, the landing gear had not been extended, causing the engines to make contact with the runway. As the aircraft touched down on its engines, sparks flew, causing it to bounce 3 times. Realizing that stopping safely was not possible, the captain quickly initiated a go-around maneuver. This entire sequence was observed from the ATC control tower. They noticed that the aircraft had landed without the landing gear extended and that the engines were damaged. At this point, the right engine had completely failed due to damage. Shortly after, at an altitude of 59 feet, warnings began to sound. ATC started contacting the pilots. When the aircraft reached 2,100 feet, the pilots realized that both engines had significantly lost power. They urgently requested clearance from ATC to land. ATC granted landing clearance immediately. However, by then, both engines had failed, and the aircraft's speed had decreased significantly, making it difficult for the pilots to maintain control. The pilots extended the landing gear, but the aircraft began to stall. At this critical moment, the aircraft was over a densely populated area. The captain immediately issued a mayday call to ATC, marking their final communication. Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 crashed into the Model Colony neighbourhood in Karachi. The impact damaged 18 buildings and killed 8 people on the ground. Tragically, only 2 passengers on the aircraft survived. When investigators examined the cockpit voice recorder, they found that the pilots were engaged in a lengthy conversation. Additionally, they were distracted by eating or drinking water while fasting, which weakened their physical and mental state. This distraction impaired their ability to make timely decisions. Moreover, the pilots neglected to manage checklists and ignored multiple cockpit warnings. Investigators concluded that the pilots overlooked critical procedures and alerts. In their published report, they stated that the accident was solely due to the pilots' carelessness. The crash of Pakistan International Airlines Flight 8303 was an avoidable tragedy that could have been prevented with more careful and attentive piloting.